So welcome. Good. I want to welcome everyone. My name is Sonu Bedi. I'm a professor in the government department, and it's a real pleasure to be the host and moderator of this panel entitled How We Study Race. And so the origin story of this panel is that it's part of the Department of Government's Vow to Act. The Department of Government is hosting sessions in each term. We did last term, and so this winter term, we're doing it on how we study race. And I thought it would be really interesting. We often bring speakers to campus to discuss their work. And I thought this would be a nice opportunity to discuss the work of our very own faculty, particularly folks that I have read their work and very much admire and appreciate what they do and get a sense of how they study race. And so I want to just sort of give a shout out to the sponsors here. In addition to the Department of Government, I want to thank the Rockefeller Center, who's doing all the logistics here, and also Joanne in particular. I want to thank the Consortium on Race, Migration, and Sexuality as a co-sponsor, and also the Ethics Institute. So here's how we're going to proceed. We're going to have a discussion, and so it looks like we have a good number of participants, and we'll have some time for questions towards the end. And this is also being closed captioned. And so you can ask your question using the question and answer button at any time. We may not get to it until the end, but hold on. Okay, so with that, let's get started. So first I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, the department they're in, because part of this is seeing how we study race across disciplines, their area of research, maybe how long they've been at Dartmouth, and what classes they're currently teaching. So why don't we start with you, Kimberly?
Okay, thank you, Sonu. I am Kimberly Juanita Brown. I am in the Department of English and Creative Writing here at Dartmouth. I'm new to Dartmouth. It just started on July 1st. I work on 20th century literatures of the Black diaspora and visual culture, mainly photography. And this term, I'm teaching self-subject photography. So it's a course on memoir, confessional poetry, and self-portraiture photography. Next quarter, I'm teaching African diaspora women writers, Black women writers class. Glad to be here.
Excellent. Thanks, Kimberly. Eng-Beng, you want to go next?
Hi, Sonu. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for all you do at Ethics Institute, Sonu. I'm so appreciative of your work. I'm a fan. Thanks to the Rocky Center for helping to administer this event. And so grateful to be among colleagues to talk about race tonight. I'm Eng-Beng Lim. I am an associate professor of women's gender and sexuality studies. And I'm also directing the Consortium of Studies in Race, Migration, and Sexuality. This is my, I think, 7th year at Dartmouth, which is by far my longest standing relationship. And I teach a range of courses. I am teaching gender and sexuality in Asian American literature and English, which is cross-listed in WGSS this quarter. I have also taught a number of courses including radical sexuality, of color, wildness, and fabulosity. I've also taught queer popular culture and queer and feminist professions, which is a course for senior seminarians in WGSS, for our majors to think back on their career in WGSS and to project, beyond Dartmouth, how they might profess queerness and feminism in the dual kind of performative of professing as articulating, but also professing expertise in. So how might they think through queerness and feminism professionally? I'm also going to be teaching a number of courses that will be offered through the RMS Consortium as a minor. including new courses such as Introduction to Race, Migration, and Sexuality, which I taught last year, and we'll be repeating it again. And I look forward to our conversation tonight.
Thank you, Eng-Beng. Deborah, you want to go next? Unmute, Deborah, just unmute yourself so we can all hear you, yeah.
Thank you all this evening. First of all, for those organizations that have helped to organize this, thank you very much, Sonu, for the invitation. I too am delighted to be with my colleagues. My name is Deborah Karyn King. I am in the Sociology department. I think I probably top everyone here in terms of I've been at Dartmouth for 4 decades. And my areas of research, broadly speaking, include race, class, and gender, law, deviance, and social control, and then more recently, historical sociology. In terms of the courses that I teach Constructing Black Womanhood, which is a survey of Black women in North America, specifically the United States. I teach a course on the sociology of law, a course on prisons, one on deviance and social control. Most recently, I've added a course on Dartmouth and slavery. And next term, I will be teaching the senior seminar in sociology, the sociological imagination.
Excellent. Thank you, Deborah. Matt?
Hi, everyone. Thanks very much, Sonu, for organizing this, and thanks to our colleagues at the Rocky for doing all the logistical work. And it's great to have a chance to share the evening with colleagues and everyone else who's out there as guests. My name is Matt Delmont. I'm a professor of history and an affiliate of SSS, which is African and African American Studies. I've been at Dartmouth just 2 years now, 1 full year with the COVID, so it's kind of still feel new, kind of like Kimberly. My work is on African American history, modern African American history, and history of civil rights. I'm not teaching this term because I'm on a fellowship to finish a book. But in the fall, I'll be teaching History of Civil Rights, which is History 22, and crosses with SSS 80.06. And then History 2, which is a co-taught course called Everything Has a History, Understanding America Today, where we try to make sense of what the heck is going on in the country from a historical perspective. And really look forward to the conversation this evening.
Great, wonderful. As you can see, by the way, I've been here at Dartmouth now maybe for 12, 13 years. And so we have a range of academic sort of experiences and backgrounds. Already you can see that. And so we're just going to jump in. And so the first question that I have for the panelists is sort of briefly describe what would you characterize? Like, I'm in a Department of Government, we talk a lot about methodology, right? Now, I don't think methodology is just for our empirical folks to talk about. Methodologies, perspectives, we all use various methodologies and perspectives. So the first question to you all is, what methodology, perspective, framework do you use when you're studying race? Or if you use various frameworks, and how do they connect to your discipline or department? And so we'll go in reverse order. Matt, you want to take that?
Sure. I think it's a great question. So when I think of methodology, I tend to think of, as a historian, what we count as evidence, what sources we listen to, and then what kind of questions we ask of those sources of that evidence. I think it really depends on which historian you're talking to about how you approach that. But for myself, for someone who does work on Black history, and I'd say for other folks who do work on communities of color, that question of what you count as evidence is really important. Because you can look at official sources and really have no sense that Black Americans were in this country or that they did anything to build the nation. You can also have no sense of how deeply entrenched racism was. So I think really getting a sense of how you're going to try to get those kind of counter perspectives into the story, and how you can also try to read the official sources in different ways. Because you can actually use those official sources and ask different types of questions from them and actually tease out information that gives a truer, more full picture of what was actually going on. So, and for me, it's about what sources you use and how you try to put those sources, marshal those sources to tell different types of narratives.
Thank you, Matt. Kimberly, you want to go next?
Sure. So I usually tell people that I study literature and visual culture, but I'm trained in African American and American studies and interdisciplinary PhD program. So from my point of view, for my research projects, especially the first one, the repeating body, I was interested in telling the story of the transatlantic slave trade as contemporary artists and writers envisioned it, from the point of view of the visual, even though it was visual culture and literature. So it wasn't really a reverse order for me. It's, you know, close reading, same way, but also putting literature and visual culture in conversation, which was my methodology, not necessarily a methodology, but it is the way that I approached the archive or the archives. And I was really interested in, you know, what the aftermath of slavery, or what Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery, looks like in literature and visual culture, especially when Black women cultural producers are creating these works.
Great, thank you, Kimberly. Deborah, you want to speak maybe about your methodology or framework?
First, I probably want to begin by saying, for me, it's really important to clarify what I mean when I use the term race. And I think often race becomes a proxy for a number of different characteristics, whether it's talking about sort of a demographic that many sociologists might use, like age or socioeconomic income or level of education. We sometimes use race to refer to a social group and its culture, its ethnic practices and ideas. It seems to me we also use race to talk about racial bias or racial prejudice. And for me as a sociologist, and in much of my work, I'm also interested in race as a social structure, something that organizes not only society as a whole, but that informs the arrangements, both structural and normative, of different organizations within a society.
Eng-Beng?
So for me, I work at the intersection of performance and cultural studies, Asian and Asian American studies, post-colonial and diaspora studies, and queer studies is one of my primary analytics. So to think about race at the interstices of these different fields is for me to think through performance as a primary method and site of analysis. And that's really where I come from in terms of training. And performance studies is without a disciplinary destination. It is in many ways a trans and anti-disciplinary way of thinking. My method, so to speak, is to use performance and its vocabularies to understand behavior and the relationalities between people and the environment, and to understand through performance vocabularies how we might understand race not necessarily as a singular issue, but as it is tied to questions of queerness, class, disability, nationality, sexuality, and so forth. So performance studies, queer studies, and culture studies have very promiscuous methodologies and theoretical acuities. And that's where I inhabit in terms of my thinking about race. It is to figure out with my compatriots in various inter and anti-disciplinary formations how they approach the questions found therein, and to figure out what does it mean to think through colonial racialization, not as an issue in and of itself, but how it transposes across time and space in the Asias where I circulate in terms of my thinking. So that is to say, how might we, for instance, in my first book, think through the queer encounters of the white man, brown boy diet, not as a sociological issue, but as a conceptual, performative, sexual coupling that is transposable and transmogrifiable, or could be transmogrified across time and space in the Asias, from Bali, Singapore to Asian America. So for me, the question of race has to be tied to different spheres, including colonial, diaspora, and transnational spheres.
Okay, great. I like this promiscuous methodology, Eng-Beng. That's what, we have obviously a historian, Matt, you're focusing on evidence, in a way, Deborah, you're looking at social structures. Kimberly, you're looking at sort of performance. Sorry, Eng-Beng, you're looking at performance, and Kimberly, you're looking at sort of this visual and cultural, framework. And so, but just open it up now to, how has this framework in some way challenged or upended conventional wisdom? Or how have you seen these frameworks advance our understandings of race and, taken, Deborah, because you're right, race can be a proxy for various kinds of characteristics. So that depends on how you're looking at it. But what would you say about how these frameworks have advanced our understanding of either race or how we approach it? So yeah, does anyone want to start us off? Jump in. Yeah, please, Deborah.
For me, I would go back, I think, to my article that has been foundational for the whole development of what's called intersectionality. And I know for many, it's been a sort of characteristics of individuals and looking at how race, class, and gender might shape their identities, may shape their life experiences. And that was certainly part of the genesis for that project. When someone, I think when I first came to Dartmouth, asked me, did I identify more strongly with being a woman or with being Black? That question made absolutely no sense to me. So the article, Multiple Jeopardies, Multiple Consciousness, came as a response, my response to that question being posed. But I think for me in my research, and what I sought to demonstrate in that article and my work since, is that I think of the ideas of race, class, and gender and intersectionality as being a structural phenomenon. That it's not simply the identity of individuals or resides or is embodied in bodies. It's not just attitudes and perspectives, but really understanding how, let's say, the economic system is racialized in particular ways. And when I say racialized, it's not just merely which racial groups are in what categories, but how we even think about different occupations, how they reflect different expectations of different, in quotes, the socially constructed different racial and ethnic groups, but also how the experiences of the economic world is determinative, not just merely in terms of a singular race. That we need to be mindful of how structurally race may manifest itself differently. So for example, to take a more recent situation, often we're talking about Black Lives Matter, right? And Black Lives Matter created for the populace and often for many scholars, simply this idea and this model of it's white police officers shooting innocent, unarmed Black men. And if we stop at that point, right, we missed the real understanding about the nature and the racialization of police use of force and what we call law enforcement. So the social movement, Say Her Name, introduces, the experiences of Black women matter too. And when we incorporate them, we begin to see a very different use of police force. And I also push my students to say, and we don't end there. We begin to look across different racial and ethnic groups, as well as different social classes, just different genders and gender expressions, to really observe wholly how police operate. So it's Native American people who disproportionately suffer from police violence, right? We ignore the Latinx population, that often the forms of violence that they experience it does come from certainly local police, but it's much more immigration officials. And so we have to broaden and complicate our understanding of the phenomenon of how race operates structurally in society.
Okay, picking up on Deborah, broaden and complicate. I think that's in a way this intersectional analysis. I have this as one of the questions. So let's talk about that. I mean, how would Matt, Eng-Beng, Kimberly, how do you respond? Do you see this intersectional analysis playing a role in your work? I know Eng-Beng, you know, your methodologies are promiscuous, right? So there's going to be a lot of intersectionality, I take it, you know, and so, yeah, I mean, how do you all see that?
I'll take a stab at this question, and to think through the complications of queerness when we analyze questions of race and racialization. Oftentimes we think of race and racism as fixed experiences. And in my research on performance practices in Asia and Asia America, the question of colonial racialization is often understood through hetero-orientalist frameworks in which the white man, brown woman dyad comes to the fore as the signature problematic for understanding how we understand the the Orientalist tropes of the other. So whenever the two meet, we find the tropic spells of the white man as always already having gravitas, expertise, knowledge, capital, is a manly man, in contradistinction to his nativized or ethnic other, who is lightweight, racially castrated, bound by tradition, full of mischief, is in need of discipline, and so forth. So this is entrenched in the exotic imaginary of any number of colonies that have been subject to Orientalist exoticization. Now, the question of queerness, which is what I examine in my book, complicates this dynamic in such a way that the colonial violence that attends to the Balinese kecak, which is the monkey dance, a performance form that has been reinvented by a gay German expatriate artist who lived there in the 30s in the fabulous coterie of Margaret Mead, Noel Cowell, Charlie Chaplin, and others, who helped to foment the Dutch colonial makeover of Bali as paradise. So the queer investment in this fantasy created this ritual choreography and performance through the fantasy of boy love and various other kinds of adoration between Walter Spies and his coterie of men in the salon with the locals. So part of the contention that I'm trying to put forth here is that we need to complicate discourses that think through heteronormative conceptions of Orientalist racialization, and to figure out how differently race and racialization functions in queer encounters and practices. And this is this has huge implications in terms of thinking about East-West relations and so forth. And it comes back to the Asian American questions around masculinity and how might we understand the fetishization of Asian men by white guys in the gay subculture scene as Rice Queen's figure, and to think through that figure as not just a subcultural fetishization, but that it has a colonial prehistory, and to think through these complications and to see how might we figure out the way that performance in its capacities and its capaciousness as a method and analytic might broaden how we understand these questions.
Okay, Matt, Kimberly, you want to pick up on this sort of intersectionality? I mean, interesting to see how you would see your research as informing that, or?
Matt, do you?
Why don't you go first, Kimberly?
Okay. All right. So I'm going to start from the point of view of my current project, which examines a kind of history of the relationship between photography and anti-Blackness. It starts from the first project, which examines Black women's relationship to contemporary representations of slavery. And so it's really extending an argument that is about hyper-visible, invisible kind of presence where Black people are for the contemporary project, they are the default register for dead bodies on the cover of national newspapers. Particularly, I'm focusing on the New York Times, and I'm focusing on 1994, and I'm looking at all of these images through 4 geographical frameworks: South Africa, Sudan, Rwanda, and Haiti. Vast majority of the images of extreme violence and death are from Haiti. The fewest images are from Rwanda. So we're talking about a framework where it is highly uncommon for someone to walk by a newspaper stand in the mid-1990s and see a white person photographed. You will not see a white person photographed dead on the cover of a newspaper. So then the question is, why is it understandably perfectly fine to have Black people in different national frameworks positioned in this way? And I got, it took a long time for me to figure out the here to there from the first project to the second, but it is about who is disposable when. This is not something that holds for Black people perpetually. It's not a completely 20th century phenomenon. It actually ends for about 5 years after September 11th. And then the default register is South Asian, Middle Eastern. Somebody who looks Muslim then occupies this space and occupies this space for years. So, the way that Deborah, you were speaking about bringing Black women into the framework of something like Say Her Name, I'm, constantly talking about an ethics of looking, because if it is okay for participants to see Black people positioned in this way, then that means the door is open for other people to be imagined this way. And it also means that people who are being slaughtered and not photographed are completely absent from this archive. We will not know what happens to them and when. But there's this constant iteration that has to do with Blackness and available dispossession that is photographically rendered, which is why I decided to focus just on photography for the second project, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yes, thank you, Kimberly. Matt, did you want to?
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, picking up on what Deborah said about the different stories we might tell about racial structures. I think if we look at some of the everyday history and sort of the lived experiences of Black people, particularly in the 20th century, we can see intersectionality there before the term is actually coined, right? So looking back at Ida B. Wells, looking back at Polly Murray, Ella Baker, Rosa Parks, Fannie Lou Hamer, looking at a Combahee River Collective, right? I think it's, again, about how we choose to listen to sources and how we are able to sort of weave those into the stories we're telling, that to take nothing away from the theoretical frameworks, I think, allow us to see these things even more sharply. But I think we can go back then with even more rigor and look at at some of these sort of lived experiences and recognize that people were using different terminology to try to sort of make this plain, but it's been there all along.
I'm going to follow up. I mean, I've gotten some questions, and so if you have a question, you can post it. And so Professor Trika Keaton has asked a question and rightly notes that Deborah, your, of course, article on multiple jeopardy, multiple consciousness is really foundational for intersectional theory. So that's why I'm glad that you started off when talking about this. And so her question is, which is an interesting one, does intersectionality, however, risk minimizing or diminishing the role of race in a racialized world? I mean, do we lose something when we engage in an intersectionality analysis, put differently, or how would you all, the panelists, respond to that? Deborah, happy for you to chime in if you'd like.
Thank you for the question, Trika. I think for me, it's never an either or. That in my own research, it's my methodology and how I approach things is always based on both the question that I'm asking and the kind of evidence that I have. And so I don't approach my work as sort of race on one hand and intersectionality on the other. And that I have to sort of defer to one versus the other. For me, it's through the process of analysis in a given situation for a specific set of dynamics or organization or situation that I can identify what is more salient in that context. And in some cases, it will overwhelmingly be race, but at other times, class may be more, it's not that race disappears, but may be more salient for answering the kinds of questions that I'm posing of the evidence that I have. So I sort of reject either or thinking in decisions. It is really much driven by the questions and the methodologies that we choose.
If someone can follow up on that, one other question, because in listening to the way you all are sort of, setting up your scholarly work and sort of exploring questions of race is, how has research on race changed in the last maybe 5 or 10 years? Are scholars studying it differently than they did in the past? Maybe Matt, I'll let you sort of take that off because you're a historian, so.
I think absolutely. I think the work continues to evolve. I think as my colleagues have sort of spoken to, the sort of global dimensions that people are finding both historically, but also contemporarily, the methodological innovations and the sort of theoretical innovations that people are bringing to bear are there too. I think people are also rediscovering some work that is generations old that I think is, Du Bois's Black Reconstruction is never out of style, right? That is as clear of an analysis of what's going on in America today as anything else. I think for me, the question I can keep coming back to when I think about work today is, who are we accountable to as scholars and who are we trying to speak to? I think that's really hard for those of us working in the academy, is that if we're trying to get tenure, we have to speak to a certain audience to sort of be legible and sort of to get tenure. But then there's a whole other set of people we want to get our work in front of, that if we're trying to shape larger conversations, whether it's in terms of policy, whether it's in terms of activism and organizing, that there are different ways of sharing research, different ways of communicating, different ways of building collaborations that I think are really hard to actualize sometimes within the structures of the academy, but I think are crucially important given everything that's going on right now. So I think I'm as interested in how and with whom we're sharing our work as I am with the work itself.
And Matt, that connects to what you're currently working on, right? You have this sort of Black everyday experience, quotation sort of, and you have a website. And so is there a sense in which the research is, moving in a direction where those kinds of outcomes or those kind of, that kind of work is being seen as scholarly?
Thank you for mentioning that. So the project is Black Quotation, which you can find online. It was published last year by Stanford University Press. And then it circles back to kind of something Kimberly was mentioning. So for me, it was a deeply personal project that as I was teaching in the midst of Black Lives Matter, so Walter Scott's murder in 2015 was the one that really kind of resonated for me. I was in the classroom and sort of had laid the foundation to sort of talk about the history of lynching, photography, Emmett Till, the Rodney King rebellion in '92, and the way in which having that sort of videographic evidence didn't provide justice. And yet I didn't feel like it was doing much in the classroom. I just felt like I was still confronted with Black death constantly and really was kind of at a loss for what does it mean for me as a scholar to have any sort of purchase on this conversation, or me as a Black person, how to navigate this. So Sonu, the reason I kind of went to this kind of everyday approach to history was one, just to try to give myself some bearings, to look back at African-American newspapers and try to get a sense of what's there beyond just Black death, right? That I sometimes hate the fact that Black history gets just categorized as marches and martyrs. That's certainly an important aspect of it, but there's so much more there in terms of Black joy and the just sort of the everyday pleasures and complications of Black life. And for me as an individual scholar and as a Black person, trying to sort of make that part of my scholarly approach and part of my teaching helped to orient me in a very, very difficult time as we're trying to live through this moment where it's hard to know what you're supposed to be doing as a scholar.
Kimberly, you want to think of that? I mean, I think of your ethics of looking here and sort of how that, is that a new person? I mean, how do you situate in terms of the way the scholarly work has gone?
So yeah, thank you for that. The ethics of looking, I had to start thinking through my classes, what was being shown, why, how we would have a discussion around violence against Black people across the diaspora, and also not, reproduce that violence. That was the difficulty. So I would say a large part of my training as a scholar and then my training as a teacher is about unpacking and undoing a lot of that work. So if we look at lynching photographs, then we don't look at the lynched body. We're really looking at the crowd. I'm much more interested in who's participating in this kind of event and why. And then we can have a discussion about what's possible or less so when it comes to Black freedom and Black subjectivity. And, the other part of that is really trying to figure out, it took me years again to understand that I couldn't show the vast majority of the images that I was talking about. That wasn't possible. I gave a talk a few years ago and I discussed Emmett Till, the photograph of Emmett Till, the very famous photograph. And during the Q&A, I was asked to show the image. The person said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And I had started the talk by saying, "I'm not going to show you this image." So again, in my classes and for myself, it is about what is possible to discursively to present, and then what traumas are being reintroduced to people who are already traumatized, right? So trying to make sure that is not in place. And so I found actually working with literature offsets a lot of the violent imagery, because there are plenty of writers and poets talking about these moments of violence against Black people, anti-Black violence, and then even the imagery that becomes famous afterwards. So it's a balancing act, but I think it's really important that people see you as the process and the product, which means you're trying to carefully move through these archival spaces and not do further damage. And that's really important. Like this is my audience. I'm just assuming that there is somebody in that space for whom it's really important. Students used to routinely ask me, "Am I showing this image or am I showing that image?" And I'm like, I would never show that image in class. And that's what I want them to understand about, part of this participation is in undoing a lot of what's expected. And people expect to see Black people suffering, and people expect to see Black people photographed dead. So that has to not be a part of what I am doing, even as we're discussing the import of what this means for Black people.
That's fascinating, Kimberly. Yeah. Eng-Beng, wanted to mention something about how you see the change and sort of how race is studied?
Sure. This is a great question. I think that, the question of what's changed, around research on race has to be considered alongside what is unchanged about some of these studies. And that has to do with Black feminist axioms and principles that Deborah talked about. And principally, I'm thinking of the refusal of binary thinking. And I think that that's a really important lesson that continues even as we think through transnational and decolonial approaches to questions of race. And for students who are tuning in and who are thinking about global analytics, transnational thinking, and applications of these studies in any area of scholarly and research pursuits they may have, especially in the social science. I think that what's really important to follow up from the refusal of binary thinking is assemblies of interpretation and a constellated approach to thinking around race, which is what the RMS Consortium is trying to do by thinking through transnational, decolonial, and comparative thinking and practices of race, and to engage many of the interventions that were made possible by Black feminists, to think about anti-Black racism, not just as a US issue, but as a global issue, and to think about how we might understand alongside this absolutely imperative question, what are the other colonial formations and afterlives of race around anti-Asian racism, around anti-Latinx racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and so forth. And to think about them not just as a singular issue, but how might we think through the different assemblies of how racialization works, including gender, class, nationality, and so forth. And it's not a fixed formula. What is at stake in the question that is first raised will determine the kinds of constellation of analytics that are then configured to answer those questions. So I think that we need to figure out what is it that students, researchers are trying to unravel, think through, and figure out. And how might we use assemblies of methodologies, constellations of analytics, principles of Black feminist thinking, and so forth, to figure out, ways of thinking about race that's not singular, that's not just one thing. And the last thing I would say is, we just taught my good friend Aiko Day's article, in which she proposes going beyond binary thinking that is calcified around Black, non-Black, settler, Indigenous thinking, so that we might be able to open up a space for thinking about race beyond these entrenched binaries and open up coalitional solidarities, analytics, and anti-racist thinking that brings in a very dynamic set of questions around anti-colonialism, anti-capitalism, and so forth.
Good. Thanks, Eng-Beng. And so I'm going to follow up with you and Kimberly. We've been talking about teaching. So Professor Bruce Dutu asks a question: has your teaching of race changed over time? If so, what do you attribute that change to? And Deborah, by the way, I'm looking at you since you have I'm going to add, there have been a few other questions about teaching. Someone else asks, do you find that students self-select courses with race? With a focus so that those students who are the least sensitive to these issues are less likely to study them. So how do we go beyond preaching to the choir, that's such a good, in a way, then how do you connect these discussions, or what do you do in terms of the classroom? So I know there's students on this webinar, and so Deborah, you want to take the first stab at that? I'm glad I'm the moderator, right? I can ask the questions.
Yes, it has changed. And what informs the changes is certainly the scholarship that's taking place and developing within the various fields that I'm interested in, or subfields. It also changes in part by what's happening currently in the world, because I often, in my classes, although I often bring in contemporary issues and events that we're using the concepts and the methods to think through them, even though many of my courses actually begin with a historical foundation. So even in the courses, there's this idea of changes over time. So that's changed. I am always striving to not simply reduce race to a single race. And do students self-select? Indeed, they do, but probably not in ways that those who haven't been in the classroom or teaching certain subjects might imagine. So for example, I will have students in my course on constructing Black womanhood that tends to be disproportionately women of color and very few men. Sometimes there are more women of African descent in the class, but not always. In the course on Dartmouth and slavery, it has been a wide mix, and have often been students who really don't know a lot about the topic and are interested in discovering something more about the area or the field. So I'm also finding that in a classroom, and I'm sure my colleagues will talk about this, is a challenge of having some students who have thought carefully and studied long and hard about issues of race, and then someone who is just beginning to explore it in an academic setting. And how do you make a space that allows them to begin those initial explorations, while others may be wanting to advance the argument far beyond where others are. So I'm often in class being mindful of both encouraging debate, but also ensuring respect. And if students will not play devil's advocate or ask the difficult questions, I will do so.
Does anyone else want to, Matt, Kimberly, Eng-Beng? And by the way, if there are questions, you can post questions, start posting questions if you have them, by the way, audience. And so I'm looking, and I try to slot them in when I can. So.
So I just wanted to say, along that road, the one thing that I think I've been able to consistently get across to my students is that, the study of race, or to think about race, to consider it, is not, there's no end zone, there's no day where you get a certificate because you've won, because you now fully understand what it is to be a racialized subject, and that is okay. That you're a work in progress does not, you don't walk a plank, you don't have to, on Tuesday, you can be working through all of the layers of privilege that you possess, and on Wednesday, you did not solve the problem of racism, and that is okay, that it needs to be a perpetual, process that you're undergoing. That gives them room to not be, because it kind of takes away from, I routinely teach like kind of intro to gender studies, and students will say, not about, sexuality, that they have achieved this, this hierarchy of understanding, and not about sexuality, but they will say, I'm not racist, and I don't know why they bring that to this space as a kind of need to say, look, I'm not. And I'm like, this isn't you're not getting a cookie or certificate, this isn't over. This is work that you have to do every day. Every day I have to do work to not be homophobic, to not be transphobic. It is not something that I took an exam and I ended it on a day and I got a certificate and a cookie. So to understand that this is an ongoing process that goes beyond your college education is, I think, a sigh of relief for the students that I have who just need to know that they are an ongoing process of, coming into being. It's not over when you graduate from college, and it didn't end when you graduated from high school. So that you continue the process and you continue growing is central to understanding, what we're trying to do here. I was 19th century American literature, and I was teaching like a Cummings poem, early 20th century. And I asked the students what the poem was about, and one student said, slavery, you seem to talk about that a lot. And I took that as a badge of honor, because we're gonna talk about slavery a whole lot, because how do you talk about, the construction of the United States without that? But also, why would that be outside of a 19th century American lit, classroom? It wouldn't be for me teaching, so why would that be the expectation for students to enter certain classes, self-selecting? They might also be surprised. And then there are, there's a whole group of other students who are there because it fits their schedule and they're mildly interested, and they might get something out of it that you couldn't foresee.
Mm-hmm.
Matt and Beng, did you have anything to say, or, on this question of teaching? I mean, how do you structure that with your students?
Matt, you want to go first?
Why don't you go ahead, Eng-Beng?
So for me, I'd like to begin by thinking about what does it mean to decolonize the curriculum? What are anti-racist pedagogies? I mean, these are fundamental questions that seem to, circumvent or even circle around questions of race. So a lot of us have done this work, for a long time. What does it mean to think through these questions as though they are only emergent recently? So it's a question for me to think through the transitions of power and powerful environments as we are moving from the bureaucratic idiocracies of the Trump regime with its murderous and cruel and ineptitude to the perceived and actual competencies, neoliberal competencies of a modeled liberalism, of which we're very familiar and for which we're very relieved that it's coming back. How might we understand race in these different environments? How might we understand, the question of racism, race and racism, and how we teach it in these different transitions? The students who come to my class are admittedly self-selected because I'm in WGSS, but I've often found that in the summer, I get a very diverse group of students from across the spectrum, and I'm very grateful for that. So students out there, this is an appeal. If you are in the sciences, if you're in the social science, please come take one of our classes because we would love to have you come think through what does it mean to dismantle white supremacy in our curriculum? Because white supremacy, which was the topic of our consortium conversation on MLK Day last Monday, is an apparatus, a set of principles, practices that are embedded deeply in epistemology, in analytics, in topical choices, and so forth. How might we, dismantle that set of assumptions in the way that we teach, how we teach it, what we teach? And students who come to my classes, help me engage with these questions as I rethink some of the assumptions that I have about my teaching, how I teach it, what I teach, and I make it a point, for instance, in the Introduction to Race, Migration, and Sexuality class, to give students a broad spectrum understanding of different racialization. It is not enough for them to only understand that the foundational violence of the US has to do with both the genocide of Native Americans as well as chattel slavery, but also the predicaments of Latinx and Asian immigrants. How might we understand the entire spectrum of US white supremacist violence against people of color? How might we understand, these questions as co-constitutive, not one or the other? So, so the RMS project for me is about trying to, constellate these approaches so that students come to us, thinking through transnational and decolonial understandings of these questions, but then go to their various interdisciplinary programs and deepen their understanding of what they have had a taste, in the RMS realm, so that they deepen, if they like, questions of Afro-pessimism and so forth, to think through what does it mean to engage in depth what Black scholars are thinking in particular topics. So for me, it's about a chance to engage with students across our campus, hoping that they will, as global thinkers, as transnational citizens and activists, actors, agents, and so forth, be able to engage with these difficult questions and conversations.
Matt, did you want to add something to that, or how do you? Yeah.
Sure. I know we're just about at 8 o'clock. I'll just say one of the things I'm really invested in as a teacher is to try to make sure students understand that they can do this work. They can be researchers, and to try to provide assignments where they can be working with those sources or working with the materials themselves. So we're moving away from just students having opinions based on whatever to having sort of evidence-based arguments that they can offer, which I think is particularly important in our contemporary media landscape.
And I take it your work is sort of expanding that kind of evidence and saying, look, there's all various kinds and we could use different kinds. So yeah, that's quite interesting. Is that right? Is that a fair statement, Matt?
I hope so, yeah. And I think what all my colleagues have demonstrated this evening is there's a vast variety of different types of materials and theoretical frameworks one can bring to bear on these very important subjects.
So yeah, so I've already received a lot of questions, so I'm looking through. So I'm just gonna, so Professor Susan Bryson has a question for you, Kimberly. And so, but I think it connects larger to the larger discussion of how we discuss race in our, in the classroom. She says, I'm really interested in what Professor Kimberly Brown said about the ethics of looking, and I'm wondering if she could say more about why reading texts about violence against Black people is less morally fraught than viewing photos or films of the same events. I share her view and also practice her approach when I teach racialized and gendered violence. But since words too can conjure up vivid imagery, I find it hard to articulate just what accounts for this moral difference. And so, yeah, you want to say something, and then, maybe we can, yeah.
This is a really important point. I would say my students' interaction with visual images is immediate, and they don't always have the time to unpack what they're looking at. And they need that time. That is the time that literature offers. As well, there is, so, if we take a text like Morrison's Beloved, there's every stage of grief, there's every notation of historical trauma. It's all located in a text that is very difficult to read. And the beauty of the language is ever present, but also the space to slowly contemplate what it means to be a subject, free and yet unfree, a Black subject, free and yet unfree, after slavery has ended. That the haunting that is Beloved is something that you can actually closely read, examine, unpack, take time with, and visual images do not offer that same negotiation. In other words, it takes time. So especially when it comes to photography, because you're absorbing so much, and the student generation, they absorb a lot of images, right? And very quick, they can tell you what is in the image as soon as they see it. The time that it takes to unpack all of that is time that they don't usually have if they are examining visual images alone. And it's not as if the literature is to buttress or just to kind of mute the presence of that violence, but it is to negotiate the space of grief and trauma being something that has to be worked through. So if the text is doing that work, the visual image it's the immediacy of it that doesn't allow for certain things to take place. And that's why I think it's important that you're really only going to see particular people presented in this way. And that tells you something about how the culture of the society or the nation is engaging that group. So it's just about time, and the classroom space only gives us so much time. And I think it's just easier to navigate if they have something else that's there as a text.
Yeah, that's interesting, Kimberly. It makes sense. So here's another question, and someone, maybe Deborah, but it's about intersectionality. Can Black male vulnerability fit within an intersectionality framework? Because often they are seen in relation to their gender as being more powerful than Black women or having more opportunities for leadership. However, they face a different reality compared to their white male counterparts. For example, Black men are overwhelmingly incarcerated. In addition, they often do not fit the category of being both a minority and female that often makes Black women more coveted or able to fill spaces in the university. Does intersectionality speak to this particular Black plus male vulnerability? Deborah, you want to take us to, it's a tough question. I'm asking you, again, nice that I can ask all
Yes, and you're not having to answer them. Thank you very much. I think I hope I'm appreciating the space where the question comes from. Though my answer probably will not be satisfactory. And intersectionality certainly allows for recognizing those situations and contexts where Black men are imperiled, let's say, where they don't have access to certain privileges and resources. But I think it's important for us, at least for my own research and in my teaching, to not see those things as fixed statuses and not assume that that applies in all circumstances and situations. And that we want to be careful about assuming that one thing we view as a snapshot represents the whole of the experience. So the reference, I think the example was in colleges and universities, and the idea that Black women are sort of a twofer and they have an advantage. It's only been for a very short historical period that that's been true. And we ignore the fact when we sort of look around campus anecdotally, and we see that there's so few Black male students and so many Black female students, that we often don't recognize that in colleges and universities in general, women are increasingly making up the majority of the student population. It's also true that demographically of the college age population are disproportionately women. So when we, here again, just simply observing a race or an intersectional example doesn't offer us the explanation for why, nor should we sort of assume that if we move into a period, if I move from talking about prisons to talking about the experience of eviction, that Black women are in a more precarious place than are Black men. So I'm always want us to be focused on what is the specific question, the context, the historical period, the geographical area, that we just can't generalize, right, across time and space on any of these issues.
Oh, good. Thank you, Deborah. Actually, here's a question for you, Eng-Beng. It's going to seem easy in comparison. What was the name of the author and article that you mentioned on thinking beyond binary thinking? You had mentioned some author, and so it would be great if you do recall that name that you could say, so that this is Vanessa asking this question. I can't hear you, or it's not coming through.
It's Aiko Day, who will be with us for our RMS Humanities Institute in the spring as our external faculty member. It's IYKODAY.
Wonderful, thank you, Eng-Beng. And so good that's that they'll be visiting. Okay, here's another question from an economics major. And says, as an economics major, and something that frustrates me about the field of economics is that the theory that cannot be empirically proven is usually just ignored. So this is problematic because, and this goes back to intersectionality, the idea of intersectionality is not something that can be easily empirically utilized. Thus, I find that it is not critically employed in empirical research. How can research reconcile these advanced models of human behavior and social theory? We will always use binary/simplified models, ? How can these ideas be translated to the empirically driven world of research today? This idea, that's a, Matt, can I? Yes, I particularly like this idea of shuffling hard questions. Look, Deborah did a fantastic job.
I think it's a great question. I think it gets to some of the foundational sort of assumptions of our different methodologies. So I would encourage any student, whatever class you're in, when your professor present something you have questions about, say, how do we know this, right? I think, frankly, some of the methodologies that economists use for non-economists don't make much sense, right? They're making assumptions about the world that no one else would believe to be true, right? I think economists know this. They have other things they're trying to accomplish, right? But I think students should press on this, right? In my class as a historian, you should press me on why are these things that I'm asserting, why should I believe that they're true, right? Same in sociology, same in WSS, right? But I think particularly for economists, there's apologies to any economists on the call, there's an assumption of truthiness with they assert in some of their methodologies. And I think if you, as students, kind of press on, like, how certain are you on these different things? And what's the point of making these assumptions? What are you trying to accomplish by oversimplifying vastly the human social world? Like, people aren't rational actors, right? We know this, yet we're trying to, for certain models to work, you have to make those kind of assumptions. So I'd encourage students to really ask those kind of difficult methodological questions. Also, there's not a one size fits all historian. There's all sorts of different economists and folks using economic type models. Among the ones I'm familiar with, Derek Hamilton at the New School, right, is someone who's doing important work on reparations, right? There are certainly labor economists who do empirical studies that, even if they're not using the word intersectionality, show how Black women, women of color, Latinx women have vastly different life chances in the labor market, right? So even if they're not showing up on your syllabus necessarily, there are people who are using recognizably economic models in vastly different ways.
Hmm.
I think we may have time maybe for one or two more questions, but one question, it's from Professor Susan Reynolds. It's coming to you, Matt, but I think it could be for all the panelists is, you know, what can the college or the academy do to make it easier to fulfill obligations to scholarship and activism? And so how do you all see sort of this relationship, which is a larger question about scholarship and activism, and is there ways in which that can be done, can be facilitated, or how do you respond to that?
That's a really challenging closing question. I'll try to answer it briefly so other colleagues can pitch in. Let me try to separate it in two ways. One, focusing on what we might call traditional scholarship by scholars of color. I think providing the infrastructures to support the work that scholars of color do, and recognizing the vast amount of service that scholars of color often perform that is sort of beyond the sort of stated job duties, advising students who are not necessarily their advisees or not in their classes, and then appreciating the kind of scholarship they're producing. I think it's often easy to not value work if it doesn't appear in a certain journal, right? It might be that the best place to publish work as a scholar of color doing particular work on some newer emerging fields isn't going to be in the journal that has the highest index rating or Q factor. That question of activism, I think, is a wholly separate one that's often linked to scholarship, but I want to sort of treat it as a separate answer. To take that seriously, I think would require a wholesale shift in how we evaluate faculty for promotion and tenure, because it's an entirely different set of experiences and ways you're allocating your time that a number of colleagues are able to do. They're able to be both scholars and activists, but that activist work is hardly ever valued in any meaningful way in the academy. And so I think it's two separate and very important questions.
Did anyone else want to respond to any of that, or had something to say? Yeah, Eng-Beng, please.
So for me, it's a question of intellectual activism. I can't tell you the number of students I've had who come to my class and then go back to their economics class with an existential crisis about the incommensurable difference of approaches that we take around capitalism and questions of labor and so forth. And I think that in one way, this is the strength of a liberal arts education, to think through the paradox and contradiction of these approaches and thinking. But and in another way, it is my second appeal for students who have not yet been exposed to humanistic and humanistic social sciences, where we take on these questions in a very different way than the economics department. Here, I really wish we have an economics professor to be in conversation with us to see how they might understand the paradox and contradictions of these approaches and figure out if it's a reconcilable difference for them. So a lot of my students in the senior seminar, where we think through feminist and queer professions, engage these questions precisely as they are entering Wall Street, as they're entering the legal profession or the medical profession, and it stays with them, even if it's a vestige of a question that I pose. And they come back to me years later to say, I remember very profoundly engaging with this question and thinking about what would it mean for me to practice feminist thinking at different kinds of moments that calls for my intervention. So, it may not be a kind of like a huge shift in terms of the monumental changes that we want to imagine. But could it be possible that in your intellectual thinking, in your activism as a thinker, you might be able to imagine an alternative, however small that may be? You might be able to think of making a difference, however small or big that might be, and to enact those possibilities in whatever profession or careers that you choose. So I think that, it's very important to think about activism broadly beyond the on the streets kind of organizing, but to think about activism as a way to agitate, activate, and think about the capacity and capaciousness of queer thinking, feminist thinking, post-colonial thinking, and so forth.
Thank you. Deborah, did you want to say something? You had yeah, please.
Yes, I wanted to say, in part, in answer to the question that Matt was posed in terms of economics, and he answered. I mean, I share the concerns that any single methodology has limitations, and that's to be accepted. And certainly for economics, since it is what can be measurable, what can we analyze through statistical methods, right? That not recognizing that there are limitations, that there are just certain questions that those methods cannot answer. Similarly, the push now for big data, the massive expansion of quantitative social science and the number of majors there is because we're pushing this institution, but higher education in general, as sort of, this is the way that we can understand the world, find solutions, solve problems in terms of policy, and yet again, not examine carefully what are the limitations and the assumptions of quantitative methods. It's often why many of my colleagues in sociology actually conduct work using mixed methods. They're using a combination of different methodologies. It may be content analysis, or what along the lines of what Kimberly's talking about, of how do we analyze documents, visual images, movies, films. It may be interviews, it may be ethnographic studies where they're in the field making observations, that you use a range of methodologies because we can appreciate that some are better suited to answering various questions. Mm-hmm. And I agree with Eng-Beng in terms of we need to broaden our idea of what activism is. And again, don't juxtapose sort of the scholarship with activism, though it is a challenge for institutions to change. And part of it may be, how do we begin the movement toward, even within the academy, of incorporating social change and activism? It may be through thinking about, Dartmouth is now encouraging experiential learning, right, in the classroom. Though faculty members aren't evaluated in terms of the aspects of their work that they do that may be utilized by community organizations, or where those who may serve as public intellectuals, that none of those things get incorporated into our evaluation, although we're being pushed to ask students to do that and to provide that hands-on experience for students.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Okay. Well, thanks, Deborah. It looks like we're out of time. Or Kimberly, did you have something you wanted to say? I don't want to mention.
I just wanted to add to that's an extra layer of labor as Matt was discussing earlier, that's usually placed on faculty of color, whether or not, you know, they say that they are amenable or that they can do this work. Activism is a full-time job plural, you know. So to add that to the list of kind of responsibilities for particular scholars and not others is also a part of the problem.
And I have a last note, an appeal to Dartmouth students to think beyond policy and legal solutions, and to think about cultural and queer ways of thinking that might provide an alternative to the answers that you are seeking. Find a different way than policy and the law.
Thank you, Eng-Beng. And so let me just finally say that this panel is about how we study race. And in a way, you got 4 trailers. Okay, go see the movie. Which means either look up Deborah, Eng-Beng, Kimberly, or Matt's work, or also go and take one of their classes, or certainly shop the class. I always tell students, come in for the first few lectures, and I would encourage you all to do that. I want to thank the panelists, thank the Rockefeller Center, and so, thank you to all for attending.
Thank you, everybody. And
Thank you so much.
for inviting us.
It's great. Thank you.